The air in Quang Tri province clung thick and heavy, a humid shroud that muffled sound and magnified every rustle of the jungle. Captain Miller, his face a roadmap of exhaustion and sun-baked lines, wiped sweat from his eyes for the 100th time that morning. His company, Bravo, affectionately or sardonically known as the Red Vipers, had been operating in this sector for weeks, chasing phantoms and ambushes that never quite materialized. This patrol, however, felt different. A cold knot of dread tightened in Miller's gut, a premonition that whispered of an unseen predator. Rumors have been filtering down from other units, stories of patrols vanishing without a trace, not ambushed, not overrun, just gone. They called the area where it happened the Whisper Zone, a mockery of its suffocating silence. Sergeant Mac McAllister, Miller's grizzled right-hand man, trudged ahead, his M16 held loosely, eyes scanning the perpetual green wall. Mac had seen enough to know when the jungle was merely hostile and when it was actively malevolent. Today, it felt like the latter. The Vipers were a mix of hardened veterans and fresh-faced F&Gs, their youthful optimism slowly being leached away by the relentless grind of jungle warfare. They moved in a staggered column, each man a self-contained island of vigilance, their senses stretched taut against the unseen. The waiting, Miller often thought, was the real combat. The moments before the ambush, the silent approach through elephant grass that could hide a battalion, the interminable nights spent listening to the symphony of unknown insects and the imagined footfalls of an unseen enemy. It was in these stretches of agonizing anticipation that the mind became its own torturer, conjuring horrors worse than any bullet. This particular stretch of jungle, a forgotten valley deep within the Annamite chain, felt like it was holding its breath. The air was unnaturally still, the usual cacophony of birds and monkeys strangely subdued. Every snap of a twig, every drip of moisture from the canopy, resonated with an ominous echo. Miller felt the weight of his men's lives pressing down on him, a burden heavier than his rucksack. He knew the NVA and Viet Cong were masters of unconventional warfare, of turning the jungle into their ally, but these new disappearances were outside even their brutal playbook. There are no reports of massive enemy movements, no large-scale offensives, just patrols like his swallowed whole by the green. The silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with menace, a promise of something far more insidious than a direct firefight. Each step felt like a trespass into an ancient, watchful territory, and the Vipers were the unwelcome intruders. The weight of not knowing was the heaviest burden of all, a creeping dread that was slowly, inexorably, eroding the very foundations of their sanity. Miller knew they were walking into something they hadn't been trained for, something utterly alien to the conventional horrors of war. The Whisper Zone beckoned, a silent maw ready to consume them whole, and they, the Red Vipers, were walking directly into its teeth, blind to the true nature of the beast. 2 days later, Bravo Company stumbled upon the ghost of what was once Charlie Company. There was no smoke, no spent brass, no body splayed in violent disarray. Only an unsettling tableau of abandonment. A tattered poncho liner hung from a broken branch, swaying gently in a phantom breeze. A field pack lay open, its contents meticulously, almost surgically, removed, then placed back in a peculiar, organized fashion. A half-eaten Saracen can, a dog-eared deck of cards, a single, polished boot. Everything else was gone. The most disturbing sight was the radio, a PRC-25, resting upright at the base of a towering banyan tree. Its antenna was perfectly extended, a thin, metallic finger pointing skyward, but the handset lay neatly beside it, its cord coiled with an unnatural precision. It looked less like a battle scene and more like a macabre art installation. "They didn't even put up a fight," whispered Private Rodriguez, his voice barely audible above the hum of the jungle. Miller knelt, examining the ground. The earth, wet and yielding, showed no signs of a struggle. No boot scuffs, no drag marks, no impressions from diving for cover. Just a faint, barely perceptible indentations of men standing, then simply not standing. Mac, his eyes narrowed, pointed to a small, almost imperceptible discoloration on a patch of moss. Blood. Miller touched it cautiously. It was dry, ancient, almost absorbed by the verdant growth. Too little for a fatal wound, too old for a recent incident. What kind of enemy does this? Rodriguez muttered, clutching his rifle tighter. They don't leave bodies. They don't leave a mess. They just take. Miller straightened up, his gaze sweeping the silent clearing. The jungle canopy here was exceptionally dense, a thick weave of leaves and vines that choked out the sun, plunging the ground into a perpetual twilight. The air felt heavy, stagnant, carrying a faint, earthy smell that was not quite decay, not quite fresh soil, but something in between, like disturbed earth. This isn't an ambush, not in the way we know it, Miller said, his voice grim. This is something else, something precise, something unseen. He remembered the old stories, the tales of the jungle itself consuming men, of spirits that haunted the deep woods. He'd always dismissed them as soldiers' superstitions, coping mechanisms for incomprehensible brutality. But standing here, in the chilling aftermath of Charlie Company's disappearance, those stories began to feel less like folklore and more like prophecy. The sheer absence of violence was more terrifying than any gory scene. It suggested a complete lack of resistance, an enemy that struck with such speed and silence that there was no time for a scream, no time for a fight. The psychological impact of finding such a scene was profound. It shattered the conventional understanding of combat, replacing it with a creeping dread that defied explanation. They weren't just fighting men. They were fighting a ghost, an invisible force that dissolved men into thin air, leaving only meticulously arranged remnants as a chilling signature. It was a warning, a deliberate message left for those who followed, a message that promised the same silent obliteration. Miller felt a shiver, not from the chill, but from the dawning realization that they were no longer hunters, but the hunted, and their predator was something far more ancient and cunning than they could ever imagine, lurking in the very ground beneath their feet. Bravo Company established a hasty perimeter, their senses now pushed beyond their breaking point. The clearing where Charlie Company had vanished became their temporary observation post, a silent testament to the eerie force they were now up against. The night descended like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating, swallowing the meager light of the moon and stars. The jungle's natural symphony of nocturnal sounds seemed amplified, distorted, each rustle of leaves, each chirp of an insect, a potential harbinger of doom. Miller positioned himself with Mac, both men staring into the inky blackness, their vision useless beyond a few feet. Their ears became their primary tools, straining to decipher the legitimate sounds of the jungle from the imagined ones, or worse, the deliberate, silent approach of the unseen enemy. The waiting became an unbearable torment. Every minute stretched into an hour, every hour an eternity. The duality of combat versus waiting had never been so stark. Combat, with its explosions and chaos, at least offered a clear enemy, a tangible threat. This was different. This was fighting the void, battling the absence of sound, the absence of movement, the absence of any discernible threat. It was a war waged in the mind, where paranoia was the enemy's most potent weapon. Rodriguez, on watch a few meters away, shivered, pulling his poncho tighter. He imagined eyes watching him from the impenetrable foliage, eyes that saw through the darkness, eyes that knew his every breath. He pictured Charlie Company, snatched silently, without a whimper, and the thought was a cold claw tightening around his throat. He'd heard the veterans talk about jungle fatigue, but this was beyond fatigue. This was a descent into a new kind of terror, where the enemy wasn't just hidden, but almost supernatural. Miller, ever the stoic leader, felt the same tendrils of dread creeping into his own psyche. He ran through every scenario in his head, an elaborate ambush, a new type of chemical agent, a tunnel system, but none of it fit the chilling evidence. The precision, the silence, the the utter lack of struggle. It defied conventional explanation. He felt a deep, primal fear, the kind that whispered of ancient evils and forgotten horrors. He checked his watch, the luminous hands crawling with agonizing slowness. 3 hours until dawn. 3 hours of this oppressive silence, this mental torture. He scanned the ground around him, his flashlight a forbidden luxury that would betray their position. He tried to remember the terrain they had crossed, the subtle changes in elevation, the density of the undergrowth. Was there anything out of place? Anything that might hide a large-scale mechanism, a trap capable of swallowing men whole? The fear wasn't just for himself, but for the young men under his command, whose faces he saw in the fleeting glimpses of their own terror. How long could they endure this psychological onslaught before their resolve shattered? The jungle itself seemed to press in on them, a living, breathing entity with its own malevolent agenda. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, as if the very environment was conspiring against them, drawing them further into its deadly embrace. The Whisper Zone was living up to its name, a place where sounds faded and the screams of the disappeared echoed only in the minds of the living, a chilling symphony of psychological warfare. They were trapped, not by a physical barrier, but by the overwhelming, unseen presence of IT, an unseen entity that devoured men and left only questions. The first light of dawn was a cruel tease, filtering through the dense canopy in weak, diffused shafts, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with every whisper of the wind. As the first hint of gray light touched the jungle floor, a new horror revealed itself. Private Rodriguez was gone. His position, a few meters from Mac, was empty. His rifle, an M16, lay neatly against a tree trunk, just as he had left it. His helmet sat upside down on the ground, a dewdrop glistening on its rim. But no Rodriguez. No sound, no struggle, no alarm. Just an absence that screamed louder than any explosion. Mac was the first to notice. He'd gone to rouse Rodriguez for his next watch, only to find the void. "Captain," his voice, usually a steady rumble, was a strangled whisper of disbelief. Miller was instantly at the spot. He stared at the empty space, then at the rifle, then at the helmet. The same chilling, meticulous arrangement as the Charlie Company scene. It was a signature, a mocking gesture from an enemy that delighted in psychological torment. "Ow!" whispered Specialist Chun, his face ashen. "He was right here. I heard nothing." Miller knelt, examining the ground. Again, no signs of a struggle. No drag marks, no impressions of a body being pulled away. It was as if Rodriguez had simply dematerialized. A cold, hard knot of terror tightened in Miller's stomach. This wasn't just a tactic. This was a deliberate, targeted act designed to break their minds. The enemy wasn't just killing them. They were erasing them, leaving no trace, fostering an unbearable paranoia that every man could be next at any moment without warning. The Vipers huddled together, their eyes darting wildly into the gloom, trust in the ground beneath them shattered. The concept of an enemy that could snatch a man from under their very noses without a sound was inconceivable, yet undeniably real. The very air vibrated with their unspoken questions, their growing fear. "They're not just taking us," Max said, his voice flat. "They're making us doubt our own senses, our own sanity. This is worse than any firefight." Miller looked at his men, their faces etched with fear and confusion. The discipline they had honed over months of brutal combat was starting to fray. Friendly fire, once an unthinkable tragedy, now felt like a very real possibility as their nerves frayed into raw ends. Each shadow became a threat, each rustle a potential assailant. The jungle, once merely an obstacle, was now a conscious, malevolent entity, actively working against them. They had been warned about wasn't a unit or a specific weapon, but an insidious methodology that weaponized the environment and the human mind. They were fighting not just for their lives, but for their very grip on reality. The silence of Rodriguez's disappearance was the most brutal sound of all. a deafening confirmation that the enemy they faced was unlike anything they had ever encountered, an enemy that could strike with surgical precision, leaving only the chilling echo of what was once a man, a ghost in the humid air of the Whisper Zone. The disappearance of Rodriguez ignited a desperate, almost frantic search. Miller, overriding his gut instinct to pull back, felt compelled to find answers. They scoured the immediate area, moving in tight, nervous formations, their rifles sweeping every inch of the undergrowth. Mac, his instincts honed by years of jungle fighting, kept pointing to subtle irregularities, patches of disturbed earth, crushed foliage that seemed to lead nowhere. Then, Specialist Chun, who had a knack for spotting the minutiae, let out a choked gasp. "Captain, over here!" Miller pushed through a thick curtain of ferns, his heart hammering against his ribs. Chun was kneeling beside what appeared to be a perfectly flat patch of ground, covered in a mosaic of dead leaves and moss. But as Miller approached, he saw it, a barely perceptible seam, almost invisible, running along the edges of the patch. Chun, with trembling hands, prodded it with a stick. The ground shifted, revealing a thin, crude wire. "A tripwire?" Miller asked, but Chun shook his head, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "No, Captain, not a tripwire. It's a lid." With a collective heave, they managed to pry up the deceptively light covering. Beneath it was a pit, not a simple punji stake trap, but something far more sophisticated. It was a narrow, cylindrical shaft, perfectly cut, descending into absolute darkness. The sides were smooth, packed earth, and the bottom was invisible, a gaping maw into the earth itself. The pit was impossibly deep, its dimensions suggesting a deliberate, engineered construction, not a hastily dug hole. The precision of the camouflage, the seamless integration with the jungle floor, was terrifying. It wasn't just hidden, it was designed to be part of the landscape, an extension of the earth itself, waiting to swallow unsuspecting prey. "This is how they do it." Mac breathed, his voice raw. "They don't spring the trap on you. They make you fall into it." Miller shone his flashlight down the shaft. The beam quickly disappeared into the blackness, revealing nothing but an unsettling void. "This isn't just a trap," Miller said, his voice grim. "This is an entrance, or a disposal chute." The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. That it was not just a series of isolated booby traps. It was a systemic weaponization of the very ground. The enemy wasn't just setting traps. They were engineering the battlefield, creating an intricate network of silent, subterranean death. This pit wasn't just a hole. It was part of a larger, unseen mechanism designed to silently capture and eliminate, leaving no trace. The brutality was in the complete control, the deliberate design, the way it turned the comforting solidity of the earth into a treacherous, hungry maw. This was a form of warfare that defied their training, their experience, their very understanding of combat. It was a chilling testament to the enemy's ingenuity and their intimate knowledge of the jungle, turning its natural elements into a weapon of psychological terror and physical obliteration. They were fighting not just a guerrilla force, but a landscape that had been meticulously, malevolently transformed into a seamless, silent killing machine. The pit, a silent testament to this chilling reality, stood as a monument to their newfound, terrifying understanding of the Whisper Zone's true horror. The discovery of the engineered pit shattered any remaining illusions of conventional warfare. Miller now understood that IT was not a new weapon, but a new philosophy of combat, a systematic transformation of the jungle itself into a silent, inescapable death maze. The Vipers, their faces etched with a profound sense of dread, began to move with an almost pathological caution, each step measured, each patch of ground scrutinized. The jungle, once merely an adversary, had become a living, breathing predator. Every leaf, every vine, every seemingly solid patch of earth a potential harbinger of silent obliteration. They navigated a landscape that felt increasingly alien, its familiar contours twisted into a malicious parody of nature. Mac, with his keen eye, started pointing out other subtle alterations, sections of ground that seemed too flat, too uniform, clusters of seemingly random vegetation that, on closer inspection, appeared deliberately placed to obscure unseen dangers. The unnatural silence of certain areas, devoid of the usual insect hum, as if the very ecosystem had been suppressed to serve a darker purpose. The constant vigilance was physically and mentally draining. Every man was sweating profusely, not just from the oppressive humidity, but from the sheer terror of not knowing when the ground beneath them would betray them. They moved slower than ever before, their progress agonizingly deliberate. Each meter gained a small victory against the overwhelming paranoia. The psychological toll was immense. Men started to snap at each other, their nerves frayed to raw ends. Private Jenkins, usually a quiet, dependable soldier, suddenly lashed out at a branch that brushed his face, convinced it was a trap. Miller watched, his heart heavy, as the fabric of his company, forged in countless firefights, began to unravel under the relentless pressure of the unseen threat. They were no longer fighting a tangible enemy. They were fighting the very ground, the air, the silence, and ultimately their own minds. This was the true brutality of it, not the sudden violence of a bullet, but the slow, agonizing erosion of sanity, the complete subversion of trust in one's own senses. They knew the enemy was here, observing, guiding them deeper into the labyrinth, into sections of the jungle that felt explicitly engineered for their demise. The oppressive silence amplified every sound of their own movement, making them feel like clumsy elephants stomping through a hallowed, deadly ground. They knew they were being watched, not by men in foxholes, but by eyes hidden within the very foliage, eyes that orchestrated the landscape, pulling invisible strings, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the final, silent trap. The ground beneath their boots felt like a living thing, a hungry beast with countless mouths, each one waiting to swallow them whole, without a trace, leaving only the chilling emptiness for those who dare to follow. The journey through this engineered hellscape was not just a patrol. It was a descent into a nightmare, where the earth itself had become the ultimate weapon, silent, pervasive, and utterly unforgiving. The air grew colder, heavier, as Bravo Company pushed deeper into what Miller now mentally dubbed the maw of the earth. The foliage became even denser, the trees so tall and close-set that the jungle floor was a perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the occasional shaft of sunlight that pierced the canopy like a spotlight on a stage. It was in one of these shafts that Miller saw it. Not an enemy soldier, not a trap, but a shadow. A human silhouette, fleeting just for an instant at the edge of his peripheral vision, about 50 meters ahead. It was gone before he could even process it. A trick of the light, perhaps, or a branch swaying in an imperceptible breeze. But the memory of it lingered, a cold prickle on his skin. He stopped the column. "Did anyone see that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Mac and Chun exchanged glances, shaking their heads. "See what, Captain?" Chun asked, his voice tight with nerves. "A shadow," Miller murmured, feeling foolish even as he said it. "A man, just for a second." But he knew what he saw, or rather, what he felt. It wasn't an accidental sighting. It was a deliberate reveal. A taunt. The enemy wasn't just hiding. They were showing themselves just enough to confirm their presence, to deepen the psychological torment. It was a silent acknowledgement, a subtle confirmation that the unseen hand orchestrating this hellish landscape was indeed human, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. The moment of fleeting observation felt more chilling than any direct confrontation. It stripped away the last vestige of the unseen spirit theory, replacing it with the brutal reality of an enemy so confident, so in control of their weaponized environment, that they could afford to reveal themselves, knowing their targets were already trapped, already breaking. The message was clear. We are here. We see you. You cannot see us, but we control everything. This fleeting glimpse reinforced the notion that Bravo Company was being herded, guided deeper into a meticulously prepared kill zone, a vast, silent maw from which there would be no escape. The environment was not just passively dangerous. It was an active participant, an extension of the enemy's will. The men felt it too, a collective shiver passing through the ranks. The realization that they were being watched, led like lambs to the slaughter, by an enemy who barely needed to show themselves, was profoundly demoralizing. The silence that followed the sighting was even heavier than before, pregnant with a new, terrifying certainty. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were on a guided tour of their own destruction, curated by an unseen, mocking enemy who delighted in the slow, agonizing descent into terror. It was no longer an abstract concept, but a living, breathing, intelligent entity that had turned the very ground beneath their feet into a weapon, and they, the Red Vipers, were walking directly into its carefully laid, silent jaws, the fleeting shadow a silent, chilling invitation to their doom. The maw of the earth finally claimed its prey. They had been moving for hours, the humid air thick with the smell of damp earth and fear, when the ground began to shift. It wasn't an explosion, not a sudden blast, but a terrifying systemic shudder, a groan from the earth itself. Private Thompson, a young radio man, was the first to go, his boots sinking into what had seemed like solid ground. A panicked cry escaped his lips as the earth beneath him dissolved, pulling him down into a yawning sinkhole that appeared with nightmarish speed. His comrades lunged for him, but the ground around them was now alive, undulating, collapsing in a terrifying chain reaction. "Stay clear," Miller roared, but his voice was swallowed by the sudden, deafening roar of collapsing earth and splintering trees. The very jungle floor beneath them was giving way, not in isolated pockets, but in a sweeping, coordinated subsidence that was clearly engineered. Logs, vines, and meticulously placed soil coverings gave way, revealing a network of interconnected pits and trenches. What they had seen as individual traps were merely parts of a much larger, cohesive design, a vast, silent, environmental ambush. Men screamed as the earth swallowed them whole, dragging them down into muddy, hidden shafts, some impaled on sharpened stakes, others crushed by cascading soil and rocks. It was not a firefight. It was a battle against the very ground, a struggle against a weaponized landscape that moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Mac, with his lightning reflexes, threw himself flat as a fissure opened directly in front of him, barely avoiding being pulled into the abyss. He watched in horror as a tree, its roots undermined, toppled silently, crushing 3 men who were trying to scramble to safety. Miller, grappling with the sheer incomprehensibility of it, saw the methodical precision in the chaos. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was orchestrated, a meticulously planned attack that used the jungle's natural geology as its primary weapon. The enemy was unseen. Their presence only felt through the earth's betrayal. The brutality was in the utter helplessness, the inability to fight back against a foe that was everywhere and nowhere, a foe that turned the very ground into a sentient, devouring entity. The roar of the collapsing earth, the desperate cries of his men, the sickening thud of bodies disappearing. It was a symphony of pure, unadulterated terror. He fired his rifle blindly into the surrounding foliage, a futile gesture against an enemy that wasn't even there, just the unseen architects of this geological slaughter. The ground continued to heave and crumble, an unrelenting force that threatened to consume every last man. This was the most brutal form of warfare they hadn't seen coming, a silent, invisible, and utterly devastating attack that proved the jungle itself, under the cunning hand of the enemy, could be the most lethal weapon of all, a silent, hungry maw ready to swallow them whole, leaving no trace, no survivors, and no understanding of the horrors they had just endured. The collapse was agonizingly slow for those caught in its maw, yet impossibly fast for those witnessing it. Miller, covered in mud and sweat, found himself clinging to the trunk of a giant fern, his legs dangling precariously over a newly formed chasm. The air was thick with dust and the smell of disturbed earth, mixed with the acrid tang of fear. The screams had subsided, replaced by the sickening groans of shifting earth and the faint, gurgling sounds of water filling the newly formed pits. He dragged himself on a solid ground, his muscles screaming in protest, his mind reeling from the horror he had just witnessed. Of the 20-man patrol that had entered the Whisper Zone, only 6 remained. Mac, Chun, and 3 other dazed, mud-caked soldiers huddled together, their faces etched with shock and unspeakable terror. Their eyes, wide and unfocused, stared blankly at the devastation, at the places where their comrades had simply ceased to be. "We need to move," Miller croaked, his voice raw. "Now!" There was no pursuit, no follow-up attack. The enemy, having delivered their silent, devastating blow, had vanished as silently as they had appeared. This was the insidious nature of no conventional battle, no lingering engagement, just a surgical environmental obliteration designed to leave survivors not with physical wounds, but with psychological scars that might never heal. The escape was a desperate crawl, a frantic scramble over unstable ground, each step a gamble against further collapse. Every rustle in the jungle, every snap of a twig, now seemed to betray a new, unseen danger. They moved like ghosts, their senses overwhelmed, their morale shattered. The experience had fundamentally altered their perception of reality. The earth itself had become the enemy, a malevolent entity that had swallowed their friends whole without a shot fired. The psychological toll was immense. They weren't just mourning the dead. They were grappling with the incomprehensible. How do you fight a foe that wields the very ground beneath your feet? How do you prepare for an attack that isn't seen, but felt as the world literally gives way beneath you? The escape was less a tactical withdrawal and more a flight from a nightmare, a desperate attempt to outrun the chilling realization that they had stumbled upon a form of warfare so brutal, so unconventional, that it defied all military doctrine. They had survived, but at what cost? The silence of their escape was punctuated only by their ragged breathing and the distant, unsettling sounds of the jungle settling back into its deceptive calm. The maw of the earth had taken its pound of flesh, not with bullets and bombs, but with the insidious, silent power of the ground itself, leaving behind a handful of traumatized survivors as a testament to its brutal, unseen efficiency. The echoes of that collapse, the desperate cries, the sickening thud of earth-devouring men, would haunt them long after they left the Whisper Zone, a silent, agonizing reminder of the enemy they never truly saw. Back at base camp, the stench of diesel and stale coffee felt alien, an unwelcome comfort after the primal terror of the Whisper Zone. Miller, his uniform still caked with mud, his eyes bloodshot and haunted, sat across from Colonel Hendricks, the battalion commander. His report, delivered in a flat, dispassionate tone, sounded almost fantastical. "They didn't ambush us, sir. The ground collapsed. They engineered it. Large scale. Pits, sinkholes, controlled subsidence." Hendricks, a veteran of Korea, listened patiently, his brow furrowed in skepticism. He had heard every wild tale from the jungle, every desperate explanation for lost men. "Captain, I understand the psychological impact of booby traps, but an entire section of jungle collapsing? That sounds like an earthquake, not an enemy tactic." Mac, standing rigidly beside Miller, interjected, "Sir, it was no earthquake. It was too precise, too deliberate. They moved the earth, made it swallow our men whole." Silently, the medical officer, Captain Davies, chimed in. "Captain Miller's men are suffering from severe trauma, sir. Delirium, hallucinations. It's a miracle any of them made it back." The disbelief in the room was a tangible thing, a heavy cloud that suffocated the truth of their experience. How do you explain an enemy that fights not with bullets, but with the earth itself? How do you convey the chilling horror of watching your men disappear without a sound, consumed by a landscape that has been turned into a weapon? The true brutality of was not just the physical obliteration, but the intellectual and psychological siege it waged. It shattered conventional understanding of warfare, leaving behind a narrative so outlandish that it was dismissed as battle fatigue or madness. Miller understood the skepticism. He himself would have scoffed at such a tale weeks ago, but he had seen it, lived it. He had watched the earth devour his men, an unseen, intelligent force guiding the very ground beneath their feet. The war, for him, had fundamentally changed. It wasn't about seeking out and destroying the enemy anymore. It was about surviving a landscape that was actively trying to kill you, a landscape controlled by an unseen, cunning hand. The report would be filed, likely dismissed, perhaps attributed to enemy psychological operations. But Miller knew the truth. He knew the Whisper Zone held a new kind of horror, a form of warfare so brutal and so unconventional that his superiors, steeped in conventional military doctrine, simply couldn't comprehend it. They didn't see IT coming wasn't just a grim joke. It was the chilling reality of a new kind of war, a war against the very earth itself, and the haunting knowledge that the jungle, under the enemy's silent command, was the most brutal, unseen predator of all. The echoes of that silent obliteration would forever haunt his dreams, a terrifying testament to the enemy he never truly saw, but whose devastating power he felt with every fiber of his being, a silent terror that would never truly leave him. The aftermath of the Whisper Zone was a quiet, insidious rot that permeated Bravo Company. The survivors, repatriated to a quieter sector, were shells of their former selves. They moved through their daily routines with a profound detachment, their eyes holding a distant, haunted look that spoke of unspeakable horrors. Miller watched them, his own soul equally scarred. He saw the way Mac flinched at sudden sounds, the way Chun meticulously examined every patch of ground before stepping, the way the others stared into the jungle's dark heart with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. The official report, as Miller had predicted, was sanitized, vague, citing unforeseen environmental hazards exacerbated by enemy actions. The true, chilling nature of the engineered collapse zones was never fully grasped or officially acknowledged. How could it be? It defied all logical military understanding, pushing the boundaries of warfare into a realm that bordered on the surreal. This bureaucratic dismissal was, in its own way, another layer of IT's brutality. Not only had the enemy physically annihilated his men, but they had also psychologically isolated the survivors, making their terrifying experience unbelievable to those who hadn't witnessed it. The weight of their unshared truth pressed down on them, creating an invisible wall between them and the rest of the world. Miller found himself staring at maps of the Quang Tri-Province, particularly the Whisper Zone, a dark, green stain on the otherwise familiar terrain. He imagined the Viet Cong and NVA engineers patiently, meticulously transforming vast sections of the jungle, turning its natural elements, its unstable soil, its dense foliage, its subterranean water flows, into a silent, systematic killing machine. They weren't just building tunnels or planting booby traps. They were orchestrating geological events, weaponizing the very ground. This was the ultimate realization of they didn't see IT coming. The IT was not a bullet, not a bomb, but the very earth itself, manipulated with such cunning and precision that it became an invisible, inescapable predator. It was a form of warfare that shattered the combatants' trust in their most fundamental sense, the solidity of the ground beneath their feet. It turned every step into an act of supreme faith, every patch of green into a potential grave. The true horror wasn't just the death, but the complete and utter lack of understanding, the inability to fight back against a foe that dissolved men into thin air without a sound, leaving only a void. The memories of the Whisper Zone would forever be etched into Miller's mind, a constant, chilling echo of the war's most brutal, unseen form, a silent testament to the enemy who mastered the art of making the earth itself a weapon and making men disappear without a trace, swallowed whole by the very ground they walked upon, a terror that would forever linger in the humid air of Vietnam. Years later, back in the States, Captain Miller, now a civilian with a quiet life, still found himself tracing phantom lines on imaginary maps. The Whisper Zone had receded into legend, a footnote in the sprawling narrative of the Vietnam War, largely dismissed as exaggerated combat stress. But for Miller and the few remaining survivors of Bravo Company, it was as vivid and terrifying as the day it happened. The war had ended, but IT had never truly left them. Every tremor of a passing truck, every creak of an old house, every patch of uneven ground triggered a visceral, icy dread. They understood, in a way no one else could, the profound horror of fighting an enemy that turned the very earth against you. The brutality wasn't just in the loss of life, but in the absolute violation of the natural order, the subversion of the most fundamental sense of security, the ground beneath your feet. Miller occasionally met with Mac, their conversation sparse, heavy with unspoken understanding. They would simply nod, a shared glance conveying volumes about the silent, invisible enemy that had claimed their comrades without a single bullet. The duality of combat and waiting had been transformed into an existential dread that lasted a lifetime. They weren't waiting for an ambush anymore. They were waiting for the ground itself to betray them, a psychological scar that refused to heal. The official narrative would never capture the true horror. It focused on visible battles, on body counts, on tangible victories and defeats. But the most brutal form of warfare they had encountered was invisible, silent, and insidious. It had weaponized the environment, turning the jungle not just into a hiding place, but into an active, intelligent predator. The Viet Cong and NVA, in their desperation and ingenuity, had achieved a level of psychological and physical warfare that transcended conventional understanding. They had demonstrated a profound mastery over their terrain, not just adapting to it, but actively reshaping it to serve their brutal ends. The lasting impact of the didn't see IT coming was not just the memory of the fallen, but the chilling realization that there were forms of warfare so cunning, so utterly unconventional, that they left survivors not with tales of heroism or valor, but with an unshakable, profound terror of the very ground itself. The Whisper Zone remained, a dark stain on their souls, a testament to the war's most brutal, unseen enemy, whose silent power continued to echo in the quiet moments of their lives, a constant reminder that the earth itself could be the most lethal, unforgiving weapon of all, a silent terror that would forever define their experience of the Vietnam War.